The most dangerous lies aren't the ones we tell other people. They're the ones we tell ourselves, the ones we build our entire identity on. And I once met a man who had constructed a fortress of self-deception so thick, so impenetrable, that it was suffocating the very people he claimed to love. He saw himself as a hero, a provider, a good husband. His wife saw him as a ghost who paid the bills. My job was to find out which one was the truth, and I had a feeling the answer was going to hurt. His name was Mark. He walked onto my stage with the kind of confidence that comes from a life of things going his way. He was in his late 40s, well-dressed, had a firm handshake when I met him backstage. He looked successful, and he was. He ran a logistics company he'd built from the ground up. He was a pillar of his community, the guy who sponsored the local Little League team. On paper, he was the American dream, and that was the problem. He lived his life on paper. He had a ledger in his head, and as long as the columns balanced, as long as he was providing more than he was taking, he believed he was a good man, a good husband. His wife, Sarah, was a different story. When she walked out, it was like a shadow had followed him. She was tired. It wasn't just in her eyes, it was in her posture, the way she held her hands, the way she seemed to shrink into the chair next to him. She wasn't there to fight, she was there to surrender. She had sent us a letter, a 10-page plea for help. That was one of the most heartbreaking things my producers had seen in a long time. She said she was married to a stranger, a man who provided everything except himself. She wrote, "I have a beautiful house, but I don't have a home. I have a husband, but I'm the loneliest person I know." That's the kind of thing that gets my attention. Because it's not about screaming matches or broken dishes. It's about a slow, quiet death of the spirit. It's about a woman becoming invisible in her own life. Before the show, I sat down with them individually. It's something I always do. I need to get a baseline to understand the narrative each person is living inside. Mark's story was simple, straightforward. He worked hard, 60, sometimes 70 hours a week. He did it for his family, for Sarah and their 2 teenage kids. He'd paid off the house. She drove a brand new SUV. They took a cruise every year. He'd point to these things as evidence, exhibits A, B, and C in the case for him being a good husband. What more does she want? He asked me, genuinely bewildered. I give her everything. I don't drink. I don't gamble. I've never cheated. I do everything right. He wasn't lying. He was just telling his truth. The problem was his truth was a balance sheet. He saw marriage as a contract, a series of obligations to be met, and by his accounting, he was exceeding all expectations. The payoff for him wasn't a loving relationship. It was the identity of being a successful man, a great provider. That was his reward. That was what fueled him. He had confused function with feeling. Then I talked to Sarah. Her narrative wasn't a list of accomplishments, it was a list of absences. She told me about her birthday last year. Mark had left a jewelry box on the kitchen counter for her before he left for work at 5 a.m. Inside was a diamond necklace, a beautiful, expensive necklace, but there was no card. He didn't wake her up. He didn't call her during the day to wish her a happy birthday. When he got home that night, he asked, "Did you get your necklace?" Not did you. Have a wonderful day. She said she cried herself to sleep that night, wearing a $5,000 piece of jewelry, feeling completely and utterly worthless. This is what I call a fundamental disconnect in the relational currency. He was speaking in the language of dollars and things. She was desperate to hear the language of time and attention. They were in the same house, in the same marriage, but they were living in different worlds. He saw her pain as a problem to be solved with a purchase. She saw his purchases as a constant, painful reminder of what he wasn't giving her: his presence, his emotional engagement. The labels they had for each other were toxic. In his mind, she was ungrateful and dramatic. He couldn't understand why all the things he provided weren't enough. So, the logical conclusion in his mind was that the flaw must be in her. She was broken, too emotional, impossible to please. In her mind, he was cold, distant, and a robot. She had given up trying to connect with him because it was like talking to a brick wall. A well-funded brick wall, but a brick wall nonetheless. So when they came out on that stage, the tension was thick. The audience could see it. He sat up straight, ready to defend his record. She sat slumped, ready to be disappointed one more time. He was there to win an argument. She was there to see if there was anything left to save. And I was there because I knew this wasn't just their story. Millions of people are in marriages just like this, marriages of logistics, not love. And I knew that somewhere in Mark's past was the reason he had learned to build walls instead of bridges. I started with Mark on stage. I turned to him, looked him square in the eye, and asked a simple question. Mark, what's your definition of a good husband? He answered just as I expected he would, running down the list I'd heard backstage. A good husband is a provider. He's a protector. He makes sure his family has everything they need, that they're safe, that they don't have to worry about the mortgage or the car payment. He said it with conviction. He believed it, every last word. He had passed his own test with flying colors. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Then I said, okay, let's talk about your father. Was he a good husband? You could see a flicker of something behind his eyes. Pride, I think. My dad was a great man, he said. Worked 35 years at the steel mill, never missed a day. He put food on our table every single night. We weren't rich, but we never went without. I nodded. I have no doubt he was a hard-working man. But that's not what I asked. I asked if he was a good husband. Did he hold your mother's hand? Did he ever bring her flowers for no reason? Did they sit on the couch and just talk? Mark shifted in his chair. This was unfamiliar territory for him. He was a man who dealt in absolutes, in concrete facts. I was asking him to describe the weather on a planet he had never visited. They were from a different generation, he deflected. They didn't do all that stuff. My dad showed his love by working. That's how men did it back then. And how did that feel for you as a boy? I pushed. When you did something great, when you hit a home run in that Little League game he sponsored, what did he do? He'd nod, Mark said, almost defensively. He'd say, good game, son. That was enough. I knew he was proud. Did he ever say, Mark, I'm so proud of you. I love watching you play? Silence. A long, heavy silence. He just stared at me. Sarah, next to him, was watching him. And for the first time, her expression wasn't one of tired resignation. It was one of dawning recognition. She wasn't just looking at her husband. She was seeing the little boy he used to be. He wasn't a talker, Mark finally mumbled. And there it was. The whole story in 4 words. He wasn't a talker. Mark's father had taught him a very specific, very limited language of love. It was a language of action, of duty, of sacrifice. It was an honorable language in its own way, but it had no words for tenderness, for vulnerability, for emotional intimacy. Mark's father gave him a blueprint for how to be a man, and it was all about building, providing, and protecting the exterior walls of the family. He never taught Mark how to live inside the house. So Mark grew up and did what he was taught. He became his father, but on steroids. His dad worked in a steel mill. Mark built his own company. His dad put food on the table. Mark put a new SUV in the driveway and paid for cruises to the Caribbean. In his mind, he wasn't just fulfilling the blueprint, He was perfecting it. He was being the best possible version of the man his father taught him to be. He never once stopped to consider that the blueprint itself might be flawed, that it was missing entire sections on communication, emotional connection, and shared experience. He had inherited an emotional legacy, and it was one of poverty. He could write million-dollar checks, but he couldn't articulate a single simple feeling without feeling like he was failing. Because in his world, feelings were a distraction. Feelings were what women did, men worked. I turned to Sarah. Sarah, are you hearing this? Tears were welling in her eyes. She nodded. I never thought about it like that, she whispered. His father was the same way, quiet, kept to himself. I always thought Mark was just choosing to be distant. I didn't realize he doesn't know any other way. This is a critical moment. It's the point where blame can start to transform into understanding. It doesn't excuse the behavior. Let me be clear about that. The impact on Sarah was real and devastating. Her loneliness was real. But behavior is purposeful. Mark wasn't withdrawing from her to be cruel. He was withdrawing into the only role where he felt competent, the provider. Because in the world of feelings and emotional needs, he was a foreigner. He didn't speak the language, he didn't know the customs, and he was terrified of getting it wrong. So he did nothing. And for Sarah, his nothing felt like a rejection. It felt like a statement that she wasn't worth the effort. The real tragedy was that Mark loved his wife. I didn't doubt that for a second. But he was trying to show it by depositing checks into an emotional bank account that had been closed for years. He thought he was making deposits, while Sarah was just getting notifications of a transaction she never asked for, a painful reminder of the currency she actually needed: time, presence, and attention. The very things Mark was never taught to value. Understanding the why is a powerful first step. It can drain the poison of malice out of a situation. But here's the hard truth. Understanding doesn't fix the damage. It doesn't erase the years of accumulated pain, the thousands of tiny cuts that bleed a marriage dry. Sarah might now see the little boy in Mark who was never taught, but she was still a woman who was living with the consequences of that man's emotional illiteracy. And those consequences had been escalating for over a decade. Their life had become a series of missed connections, a graveyard of opportunities for intimacy that Mark had bulldozed over with a checkbook. I asked them about their last anniversary. The story was a perfect microcosm of their entire marriage. Mark, wanting to do the right thing, booked a table at the most expensive restaurant in the city. He bought her a designer dress to wear. On paper, it was a perfect evening. He was providing a 5-star experience. But Sarah told me what really happened. They sat at the table, and for the first 10 minutes, Mark was on his phone, texting with a client in a different time zone. When he finally put it down, the conversation was stilted. He talked about work. He talked about a new investment. He asked if the steak was cooked to her liking. He was a host, not a husband. Sarah said she felt like she was on a business dinner with a benevolent boss. She tried to bring up something personal, something about their son Alex, who was struggling in school. Mark waved it away. We'll talk about that later, he said. Let's just enjoy this. But for Sarah, there was nothing to enjoy. The entire evening was a performance. It was a demonstration of his financial success, not a celebration of their union. She told me the car ride home was completely silent. She sat there in her beautiful new dress in their luxury car and felt an emptiness so profound it was like a physical ache. She said she looked over at him, at his handsome profile illuminated by the streetlights, and thought, who are you? And the scariest part was, she didn't think he was asking the same question about her. That was the pattern. She would present a need for connection, and he would offer a transaction. When their daughter, Emily, made the honor roll, Sarah wanted to celebrate with a special family dinner at home. Maybe play a board game. Just be together. Mark's response? That's great. I'll transfer $100 to her debit card. He wasn't being ungenerous. In his mind, he was rewarding his daughter in a tangible, meaningful way. He completely missed the point that the reward Sarah and Emily were looking for was his time, his focused attention, his shared joy. The money was an insult because it was a substitute for what they truly craved. The problem got really serious when the kids became teenagers. Their son Alex started getting into trouble. Nothing major at first, skipping class, a little back talk, but it was a clear cry for help. Sarah would try to talk to Mark about it, to present a united front. She needed a partner, a co-parent. But Mark approached parenting the same way he approached everything else, as a logistics problem to be solved. His first suggestion was to hire a tutor. When Alex's behavior got worse, he suggested a high-priced therapist. When that didn't immediately work, he said, maybe we should look into one of those boot camps. I'll pay for the best one. He was always trying to outsource the emotional labor of his family. Tutors for education, therapists for feelings, money for everything else. What Alex needed was his father. He needed a dad to throw a football with, to talk to about girls, to get guidance from. What he had was a CEO who was trying to fix a personnel problem. The escalation was clear. Mark's emotional absence wasn't just making his wife lonely anymore, it was now actively harming his children. They were growing up with the same emotional blueprint he had. The generational curse was being passed down right under his own roof, and he was too busy balancing the books to even notice. This is when the blame shifting got really ugly. Sarah, in her desperation, would get emotional. She would cry. She would yell. She would say, "Don't you care about what's happening to this family?" And because Mark had no tools to deal with her emotion, he would label it as the problem. He'd say, "Here we go again. You're being hysterical," or "I can't talk to you when you're like this." He would reframe her legitimate pain as an irrational outburst. It was a classic defensive maneuver. By making her the emotional crazy one, he got to remain the calm, logical one. He never had to look at his own part in the chaos because he was too busy pointing the finger at hers. The more she pleaded for connection, the more he labeled her as unstable. And slowly, she started to believe it. Maybe she was asking for too much. Maybe she was ungrateful. His self-deception was so powerful, it was becoming contagious. The stage is a unique environment. There are no distractions, no phones to check, no meetings to run off to. It's just me, you, and the truth. And for Mark, that was a very uncomfortable place to be. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of activity and accomplishment to avoid moments just like this one. Now, he was cornered. I looked him in the eye. "Mark, let me ask you a question, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. What is Sarah's biggest fear?" He blinked. It was a simple question, but it was clear no one had ever asked him that before. He fumbled for an answer. I don't know. Spiders? She doesn't like spiders." He gave a weak, nervous laugh. The audience was silent. Sarah just shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "No, Mark," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "I'm not talking about a phobia. I'm talking about a deep existential fear. What is the thing that keeps your wife, the mother of your children, awake at 3 o'clock in the morning?" He had nothing. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. He looked at Sarah as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as an extension of his life or a line item in his budget, but as a separate human being with her own inner world, a world he had never once tried to visit. "You don't know, do you?" I said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. "You've been married for 20 years, and you don't know the first thing about what truly frightens the person you share a bed with. Do you know why? Because you've never asked. You've been so busy providing for her life that you've never once stopped to participate in it. That was the first crack in the armor. You could see the confident CEO persona begin to crumble, replaced by a look of genuine confusion and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of shame. Now let me ask you another question, I continued, pressing the advantage. When was the last time you initiated a conversation with Sarah that had nothing to do with logistics? Not about who's picking up the kids, or what needs to be fixed around the house, or where you're going on vacation. When was the last time you turned to her and said, "Honey, how's your heart today? What's going on in your world?" He just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He had no answer, because the answer was never. This is the part of the process I call confronting the narrative. Mark's narrative was, "I am a good husband because I provide." It was a simple, clean, and self-serving story. My job was to hold up a mirror and show him the real story, the one Sarah was living every day, the story where she was a supporting character in the movie of his success with no lines of her own. "You think love is a transaction, Mark?" I said, leaning forward. "You think if you buy her enough things, if you provide a big enough house, you've done your job. But you have confused the role of a husband with the role of a bank. A bank provides resources, a husband provides connection. A bank makes deposits, a husband makes memories. Your wife is starving for emotional connection, and you keep trying to feed her money. It will never, ever work. She is not ungrateful, she is malnourished." He started to push back. It's a natural reaction. The ego doesn't surrender without a fight. "That's not fair," he said, his voice rising. "I do everything for this family, everything. I work myself to the bone." "And who asked you to?" I shot back. "Did Sarah ever say, 'Mark, please work 70 hours a week so I can have a diamond necklace'? Did your kids ever say, 'Dad, please miss all our baseball games so you can build your company'? Or did they say, 'Dad, can you please just come home for dinner? Dad, can you play catch with me?'" He flinched as if I'd struck him. "You're not doing it for them, Mark." I said, softening my tone just a bit. "You're doing it for you. You're doing it because being a successful provider is the only way you know how to feel valuable. It's the metric your father gave you. You're still that little boy on the baseball field, looking up at his dad in the stands, desperate for that nod of approval. You think if you just build a big enough company, if you make enough money, you'll finally feel like you're good enough? But you're chasing a ghost, and in the process, you are creating a ghost marriage." That was the moment, the breakthrough. The word ghost landed like a physical blow. He looked down at his hands, these hands that had built a company, signed million-dollar deals, and he looked lost. The entire edifice of his identity, the story he had told himself for 30 years, was collapsing in on him in real time on national television. He was a good provider, he was a success, he was a good man, but a good husband? In that moment, he finally understood he didn't even know what the words meant. He slowly turned to Sarah. His eyes were filled with a raw, unfiltered panic. The mask was gone. The CEO was gone. It was just Mark, a man who had just realized he was a stranger to his own wife. "Is that true?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Is that how it feels?" And Sarah, who had come here ready to give up, did something extraordinary. She didn't list his failures. She didn't recite the years of neglect. She saw his pain, his genuine, terrifying confusion, and she met it with grace. She reached out and put her hand on his. "I don't want the necklace, Mark," she said softly, her own tears now flowing freely. "I just want you." That single sentence, "I just want you," is one of the most powerful things a person can hear. It's also one of the most terrifying, especially for someone like Mark. For his entire life, his value had been tied to what he did, what he produced, what he provided. Being wanted for who he was, that was a completely alien concept. It required a vulnerability he had never learned and a currency he didn't believe he possessed. The rest of the show was a delicate, painstaking process of deconstruction and, hopefully, the beginning of reconstruction. The confrontation wasn't over. The breakthrough was just the beginning. It's one thing to have an epiphany on a television stage with the cameras rolling. It's another thing entirely to go home and live it. My focus shifted from showing Mark his reflection to giving him a roadmap for what to do next. Because insight without a strategy is just a good story. It doesn't change lives. So what do you do now, Mark? I ask. You go home tonight. Sarah's there. Your kids are there. What's the first thing you're going to do differently? Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. He looked panicked again. This was the hard part, the practical application. I don't know, he stammered. I guess I'll try to talk to her more. No, I said immediately. That's too vague. Try is a weasel word. It gives you an out. Talk more is a goal with no definition. I want a behavior, a specific, observable, measurable behavior. Let me give you one. Tonight, you're going to go home. You're going to put your phone in a drawer. You're not going to turn on the TV. You're going to sit down at the kitchen table with your wife. You're going to look her in the eyes, and you are going to ask her this one question. What was it like for you to be married to a ghost? And then, and this is the most important part, you are going to shut up and listen. You're not going to defend. You're not going to explain. You're not going to justify. You are just going to listen. You are going to absorb her truth no matter how much it hurts. Can you do that? He swallowed hard. It was probably the most difficult assignment he'd ever been given. It was harder than closing any business deal, harder than meeting any deadline, because this task required him to be powerless. It required him to surrender his narrative and simply accept hers. He nodded, a slow, hesitant movement. Yes, he said, I can do that. For Sarah, my advice was different. She had to learn to stop accepting the substitutes. Sarah, for 20 years, when you've been hungry for a steak, he has handed you a stone, and you have politely thanked him for the stone, I explained. You have enabled this by pretending that the transactional gifts were enough. You need to start speaking your truth clearly and calmly. When he offers you a new watch instead of his time, you need to be able to say, thank you for the thought, Mark. But what I would really love is for us to take a walk together for 30 minutes after dinner. You have to teach him the new language. He's not going to learn it on his own. This was a fundamental shift for both of them. He had to learn to listen, and she had to learn to speak. They had been in a dysfunctional dance for 2 decades, and now they had to learn entirely new steps. The outcome of a show like this is never guaranteed. I'm not a magician. I don't have a magic wand. Change is hard, painstaking work. It happens in the quiet, unglamorous moments long after the cameras are turned off. For Mark and Sarah, the path forward was going to be filled with missteps and setbacks. Mark would inevitably retreat to his old patterns when he felt stressed or insecure. He'd try to solve an emotional problem with his wallet. Sarah would get tired of having to be his emotional teacher and would fall back into resentful silence. It's the natural rhythm of change. We set them up with a therapist in their hometown, a professional who could help them navigate the day-to-day challenges. I made Mark commit, on camera, to scaling back his work hours. I told him to delegate, to hire another manager. You built an empire, Mark, I said. Congratulations. Now it's time to learn how to live in the kingdom you've built but never occupied. I followed up with them a few months later. The call was realistic. It wasn't a Hollywood ending. It was better than that. It was real. Sarah told me it was the hardest thing they had ever done. She said there were days when she felt hopeless when Mark's old habits came roaring back. But then she told me about a Tuesday night, a few weeks prior. Mark had come home from work at 6 o'clock, something that hadn't happened in 15 years. He walked in, put his briefcase and phone down, and just stood in the middle of the kitchen. He looked at her and said, "I don't know what to do." It was a confession, a moment of pure, unvarnished vulnerability. The old Mark would have pretended to have all the answers. The new Mark was admitting he was lost. And Sarah, instead of getting angry, walked over to him, took his hand, and said, "That's okay. Neither do I, but maybe we can figure it out together." They didn't solve anything profound that night. They just made dinner together. They talked about their son's new girlfriend. They sat on the couch and watched a TV show. And for the first time in years, he wasn't on his laptop at the same time. He was just there, present. That, to me, is a victory. It's not about grand gestures. It's not about expensive necklaces or fancy dinners. It's about a Tuesday night in a kitchen where two people who have been strangers for 20 years admit they are lost and agree to look for a map together. Mark's journey is far from over. He is essentially an immigrant learning the language and customs of a new emotional country. He will always be more fluent in the language of logistics than the language of feelings. But he's trying. He's showing up. He's beginning to understand that the greatest thing he can provide for his family is not his wealth, but his presence. He learned that being a good husband isn't about signing checks, it's about being checked in. It's a simple lesson, but for him, it was a revelation that changed everything. He thought he was a good husband until one question exposed his lies. The truth hurt, but it also finally set him free to become the man his family didn't just need, but the man they actually wanted.